Hey everyone, I am Steve from GamersNexus.net, and today we're talking about the new GTX 980 Ti from NVIDIA. This is just launched as part of Computex, and the 980 Ti has had a lot of rumors around it for quite a while now, but yes, it is a real card, it is here, and there have been a few rumors that came out recently that were wrong, and the major one is price. The GTX 980 Ti is priced at $650, which makes it extremely competitive and puts it at about where the 780 Ti was when it first launched. Along with this introduction comes the price drop of the GTX 980, which was originally $550 MSRP. It sat around $550 to $600 for retail, depending on who you bought from. And the 980 has now been dropped to $500, so you've got a $150 gap in there. The Titan X still remains at $1,000 and is a bit more powerful than both of these cards. The market placement for the GTX 980 Ti has it still strictly focused as a gaming card, and this is a thing for Maxwell. Maxwell is very gaming focused, and that's something I'll discuss in a moment. It's also positioned to take advantage of virtual reality displays as they come out, and of 4K and 1440 resolution monitors. And to this end, there's been a bigger push to focus on memory bandwidth and increased processing power, things like that. Looking at the core specs of the three primary cards we're talking about today, we'll throw in the Titan X as well. The 780 Ti had 2880 CUDA cores on it when it first shipped and 3 gigabytes of video memory. And this was a very powerful card for its time. The GTX 980 shipped at 2048 CUDA cores, so it's about 800 fewer, and had 4 gigabytes of video memory. And the 980 Ti has 2816 CUDA cores, 2816, with 6 gigabytes of video memory. For reference, the Titan X, which is a gaming-focused Titan, not a dual precision Titan, has 3072 CUDA cores, a bit more than the 980 Ti and 780 Ti, and the Titan X also has 12 gigabytes of video memory. Make a note, though, that the CUDA cores efficiency has improved greatly with Maxwell. They're about 40% more efficient than on Kepler, and for this reason the 780 Ti and 980 Ti are not directly comparable by pure numbers when looking at core count. The 780 Ti would be advantaged in some applications that care less about gaming related technologies, or technologies like delta color compression that are definitely an aid to bandwidth and gaming tasks, but may not be too useful when you're dealing with things like raw encoding. So Adobe Premiere, Photoshop, applications like that strive for all of the processing power they can get their hands on. And to this end, having increased compute power would actually be beneficial for you. For gamers, the core count doesn't really matter too much as a raw number when you're looking between architectures because it is a non-linear comparison. We can't look at Fermi architecture and directly compare core count to Maxwell, for instance. And this is true for CPUs as well. Intel, AMD both have different architectures from generation to generation. The GTX 980 Ti has 22 streaming multiprocessors, or SMs, and each one has 96 kilobytes of shared memory, which is a pretty big increase over the 780 Ti, which had 64 kilobytes of shared memory. The 980 Ti has 176 TMUs, or texture mapping units, and I've described this on the website if you're curious what those are. It's also got an increased memory bandwidth over the GTX 980 by 50%, which puts it at 336.5 gigabytes per second. So that's one of the more noteworthy differences. All the other specs are on the screen. The target audience for this video card is definitely gamers. It is not meant for users who want precision. The Titan Z and original Titan are still better for that than even the Titan X, which has 1/32 the DP throughput of single precision processing. But for gaming, we don't really care about dual precision. In fact, it can actually be a hindrance because you're doing all this extra processing that we don't want for a video game. It's not a simulation, it's not a scientific application, so it doesn't need that extra layer of precision. The GTX 980 Ti has the same GM200 GPU that the Titan X comes equipped with, just with fewer cores. A few of them are disabled, and obviously it's using less memory on the card itself. As with all Maxwell devices, at least the second iteration of Maxwell after the 750 Ti, the architecture, the technology, all of that's going to be the same as what I've discussed in the GTX 980 video in the past and the Titan X videos and articles. A few of the core items include things like delta color compression, which I mentioned previously. It looks at delta values frame to frame temporally of the colors presented in a game, and then it uses the delta between those two color values rather than an absolute. And this reduces the power required to derive the new color and render it to the screen and all of that. So it improves our efficiency overall. I'd like to make a quick note before getting to the benchmarks that NVIDIA's put out a lot of other news this week as well, including updates on DirectX 12, which is Microsoft's product, of course. And I don't want anyone to confuse the fact that the DirectX 12 technologies and the GTX 980 Ti are not mutually exclusive. You don't need the 980 Ti to use some of the DX12 technologies that are being discussed this week. Any DX12 feature level 12.1 is how it's illustrated on paper, is going to be supportive of the conservative raster that's being discussed and of other tech for DX12. So you don't need a Ti, you can get just the 980 or Titan X or 970 or any other card that supports 12 for its feature level, or 12.1 for the conservative raster and those other techs. And AMD will be in the same boat as this once they start pushing new cards out. Just to quickly go over a few of those DirectX 12 features that NVIDIA and Microsoft are talking about at Computex and other events. Conservative raster and volume tiled resources are the main items that are being showcased right now. Volume tiled resources is an addition to the existing tiled resources function in DirectX. This adds a third parameter to data structures when handling game assets. So that's what volume tiled resources does. It adds a third parameter, and that third parameter can be something like volume, quite simply. And this ensures that, for example, visible components of a texture are drawn to the screen, but the parts that you can't see aren't wasted in the GPU. We're not burning resources retaining the full texture if only a small piece of it is used. If you know what rastering is, then conservative rastering is basically just an advancement on that for GPU technology. And this is a feature that's not unique to the 980 Ti, but will be available on it. Rastering is when the geometry of a game is translated into pixels. And you can see on this image that we have here what's going on. The GPU takes samples from the middle of the pixel, and then it looks to determine whether that sample is inside or outside of the geometry. So if you sample the middle of the pixel and it's inside the geometry, then it's shown green in this image and it translates into pixels. With conservative rastering, it's a bit different. Conservative rastering counts any piece of geometry touching a pixel as in the geometry. So if you have a piece of the pixel hanging in between the geometry and outside of it, but its sample is just barely outside of it, it will still be counted as in the geometry. And that reduces the shimmering edge of a fine line in game by including adjacent pixels and then filters them appropriately. Talking about the benchmarks for the 980 Ti, we did a ton of benchmarks. There are a lot of charts. I tested 4K, 1440, and 1080 for various games with a whole suite of video cards. We excluded some of the lower end cards because it's really not within the price range of the Ti. So if you're looking at this, you don't care about like a 250X, 7850, 750 Ti for the most part. Because there are so many charts and this is so deep, I recommend that you go to the article for the full benchmark information if you want to see a particular game. I'll just recap it here quickly. In Metro Last Light at 4K with high settings, tessellation, and quality, the 980 Ti performs effectively identically to the Titan X. This is within margin of error. We're 1 FPS away. To this end, if you're just gaming and you don't care about some of the other things that the Titan X would be good at, then you should definitely be considering the 980 Ti perhaps in opposition to the Titan X and save quite a bit of money. The 780 Ti sits at 35 FPS below the 980. Now there is currently a driver issue with the 700 series cards, including the 780 Ti, where they're underperforming. That's being worked on, but either way, it's clear that there is a large gain in performance with the 980 Ti over last generation's card. Looking at Shadow of Mordor on 4K, we replaced ACU on our benchmark with Shadow of Mordor. The Titan X and 980 Ti, again, are just barely outside of margin of error, so there is a real difference here. The Titan X is just better by a small difference of 2 FPS. And then the 980 is at 35 FPS, so that's a bigger jump. It's got much lower 0.1% values as well, at 24 versus 30 and 33. 1440, the Titan X is, again, 2 FPS ahead of the 980 Ti. The 980 is at 62 FPS, well within playable range. And even the 780 Ti, the 970, the 290X are all fine, 285 is getting a bit on the slower side to the point where you wouldn't be able to play 1440 with this. Here's a few other charts like Far Cry 4, Grid. I've got The Witcher as well, and The Witcher is worth noting. We disabled Hairworks anti-aliasing and used SSAO for this for a more linear comparison with the tests we've already done, which were inclusive of AMD, and AMD is not very good at tessellation, so they're not very good with Hairworks. So that is all for the benchmarks. I'm showing you a couple more here just in case, but do check the article linked in the description below for the full review, including a discussion of the architecture and things like that if you're not familiar with it from the previous cards. The 980 Ti is an interesting device. It launched at $650, which makes it extremely competitive, even with NVIDIA's own Titan X. And it's very similar to a Titan X. I don't want to say that it's basically a Titan X because there are some core differences. Literally, there are fewer cores, and there's half the VRAM. Games right now don't use 12 gigabytes of video RAM, not that I can find at least, and very few of them use more than 4. A couple will if it's available, but the performance gap does start dwindling depending on which game you're testing. So 6 gigabytes is ample, and the core count on the 980 Ti is certainly ample as well. It's basically the same performance as the Titan X with the games we tested, and if you're playing similar games, you're considering these two cards, I would push you hard toward the 980 Ti. It is a significant value gain over the TX. The 980 is now $500, and it might be $550 after the manufacturer changes. And that's a big enough difference where you should still be strongly considering a 980 as well, depending on what your budget is. The Ti is a good performance gain at higher resolutions. At 1080, the 980 is still a very strong card. It's not going anywhere. It does fine with 1440 on some games, especially most games with settings lowered. But the 980 Ti is a better performer for the higher resolutions like 4K, most definitely, and 1440 at times where the 980 falls flat. And then AMD's closest competition that I have available is the 290X. They, of course, have the 295X2 video card, but that is a dual GPU solution and is not directly comparable to a single GPU solution like the 980 Ti, so I'm not going to draw those comparisons because they're not comparable. They're very different in their execution of what they're trying to do. And I just don't have one, so I can't test it anyway. The 290X is still a cheap card. I hesitate sometimes with recommending AMD right now strictly because of the slowness of driver updates, and that's not me being mean to AMD. It's if you look at their drivers, December was the last stable update, and then they did put out a beta patch just recently for The Witcher 3, so that's good. At least they're doing stuff like that. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at the 980 Ti, it's because you're ready to spend $500+. So I would strongly suggest looking at these charts for the 980 Ti, 980, and Titan X. I would say probably eliminate the Titan X unless you have a specific reason to buy it, and I would not be aware of that reason, so that's up to you. The 980 Ti is a good card for higher resolutions. 980 is still very strong, even at the higher resolutions, but the $100 to $150 gap is enough to make you consider, depending on how much money you've got available for this build, if you want the Ti or the 980. And the 980 Ti is very good value. I'm happy with the card and it performs well. And then for things like Premiere and Photoshop, if you're mostly doing that and not gaming, then and you've got a 780 Ti, that's still a perfectly good card for those types of tasks, and I don't know that I'd recommend upgrading right now unless your card's sort of on its last legs, or if you could use the extra video memory, and that just depends on what you're doing, which applications you're using. You'll have to research that. So that is all for this video card. Check the link in the description below for the full article. And of course, if you like our work, please check out our Patreon page. This is a new drive we're doing to help generate additional funding for all these lights and the new set we're building, stuff like that. I will see you all next time. Thanks for watching.